Missouri picked to finish sixth by the media in the SEC this season, and I don't see that as a huge insult, but just having one guy on the all-SEC team, now that does show a bit of an anti-Mizzou bias. Let's talk about that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hail, you true sons and daughters. I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And on today's program, I'm going to point out why Blake Baker, you know what? The whole defensive coordinator debate, I'm thinking it's a little bit overrated at this point. He's not God's gift to defense. And frankly, I think the players are more important. So let's talk about that coming up in the show. First, I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. The terms apply. And Missouri, you may have seen, was picked by the SEC media to finish sixth in the SEC this season. And some people took that as a bit of an insult, and I'm sure that Missouri, the locker room, is probably going to use that and it's something to prove, its STP attitude. I think you'll see that, put that on the figurative bulletin board. But to me, sixth in the poll, yeah, I could argue LSU being ahead of Missouri. I wouldn't have voted that way. I don't think that's a huge insult by any stretch of the imagination. I could even argue that Alabama should have been behind Missouri. But nobody at this point, your larger media base is not going to, is still going to give Alabama the benefit of the doubt at this point, and with good reason, quite honestly. So to me, sixth placed, I would have probably had Missouri maybe fourth, fifth, something like that. So I just don't think that's that crazy of a notion. Now, the fact that there are nearly 200 media people who are voting for this thing, and Vanderbilt got 2 first-place votes and South Carolina got 1, well, that does call the validity of this poll somewhat into question, doesn't it? So let's take it all with a bit of a grain of salt here. And by the way, 200 media people get to vote on this thing, and not me? Come on. Now, that's speaking of calling the validity of the thing into question. But really, I think it's much more insulting, quite honestly, that Missouri only got one person on any of the 3 all-SEC media preseason teams here. Of course, Luther Burden III, to nobody's shock, on first team. But the only person on any of the squads, that's pretty stunning to me. I think there's a whole bunch of guys who could have been easily considered for that. Dalen Carnell, Connor Tollison, Theo Weiss, I think easily could have been considered at receiver as well. Christian Williams, obviously, been a very productive interior player. Heck, I think I would have voted for Brady Cook over Jalen Milroe as your third-team All-SEC quarterback, too. That's just me. I'm not the biggest Milroe guy in the world. Heck, Johnny Walker obviously could have been there, and I think even Armand Mimbu or Cayden Green on the offensive line could have been considered as well, especially Mimbu with his proven production in the SEC in particular last season. So to me, even though, again, I don't think sixth in the entire 16-team league here, I don't think that's a huge insult whatsoever, but I do think the fact that only Luther Burden III made the all-SEC team, according to the media, that does show that there is a bit of an anti- or Missouri bias. Maybe not anti, that's probably a little bit too strong, but just some skepticism around Missouri, which is obviously not an historical SEC program. We're still looked at as the Big 12 team, the usurpers from the North, from a lot of the old guard in the conference, let's be honest. So, in other words, ultimately, this isn't that big of a deal. Again, a bunch of people, some of which who voted for Vanderbilt to win the league. So let's not lose our minds here. But clearly, there is still something more to prove for Missouri. They keep saying STP. I've been saying MTP. I thought they proved something last season. But to me, obviously, there's much more for them to prove up ahead this season in 2024. Now, I brought up Cayden Green earlier, the transfer from Oklahoma along the Missouri offensive line, and obviously it's been a topic in Mizzou circles about how to best use Cayden Green and the rest of this Missouri offensive line. I had predicted that SMU transfer Marcus Bryant would be the fifth offensive lineman for Missouri, but I wasn't 100% sure on how all of this was going to play out in terms of who was going to play where. Well, Eli Drinkwitz recently on the Rich Eisen show, I believe, I saw a clip of him speaking about the offensive line, and it seemed like he let the cat out of the bag a little bit. Maybe the tiger out of the bag, maybe more appropriately said. But it seems like Missouri, at least at this time, is leaning toward keeping Cayden Green at left guard, the spot that he manned last season for the Oklahoma Sooners, which is great news for Missouri. The fact that, to me, if Cayden Green is willing to frankly put his ego and maybe future prospects in the NFL slightly on hold just a tiny bit, if that makes sense, because for those of you who aren't aware, in the NFL, tackle, well, that's the bigger money position than playing guard. So you could see why Cayden Green, who's now a true sophomore with a new squad here, might want to play left tackle. And maybe he will eventually when Marcus Bryant leaves Missouri. Of course, as a true sophomore, Cayden Green has at least two, if not three more years to play at Missouri or just in college football in general. So still plenty of time for him to eventually make the transition to left tackle. But right now, as Eli Drinkwitz said on the Rich Eisen show, they're leaning toward Marcus Bryant right now at left tackle and Cayden Green at left guard. So if that's the best way for the left side of the Missouri offensive line to shake out, and that means you can leave the right side of the offensive line intact, not having to move Armand Mimbu maybe to guard or something like that from right tackle. He was a really productive player for Missouri last season. I think this is all good news, quite honestly, and a credit to Cayden Green for basically clearly saying, hey, I'm willing to do whatever's good for the team. He played probably 90% of his snaps at left guard for the Sooners last year, played a little bit at left tackle, but again, mostly at guard. So we know he can play there and be a productive player. So to me, this is all good news for the Missouri offensive line and the offense in general. And apologies to you everydayers out there who may have missed me on Friday afternoon. I was playing in the Big Three golf tournament to support the Hickman High School football, basketball, and baseball programs down at Lake of the Woods Golf Course. Had a great time. Thanks to everybody at Hickman, all the coaches and all the volunteers who made that a fun event. But you know what? That ended up in me doing a Saturday show here. So thanks for your patience. But I was talking to one of my teammates yesterday, one of my longest time friends and a big time wheeler dealer in the car business here in town. My buddy Jake actually felt like the Missouri defense underachieved last season and felt like, hey, we're not going to miss Blake Baker as much as a lot of people think. Well, you know what? I agree with half of that premise. So I'm going to get more into the Missouri defense and why I do agree that Blake Baker's loss is being maybe a little bit overrated right now by some Missouri fans, at least in terms of questions for 2024. So I want to get to all that here coming up, but first, yes, let's talk about Gametime, because this time of year, it's time to get out to the ballpark. I absolutely love Major League Baseball during the summer, and once you're past the All-Star break, man, it really starts getting exciting right now, especially when the Cardinals and the Royals are each in a chase for the wild card. Playoffs very much a possibility, so we got to get out to the ballpark. How about tonight? Royals hosting the Chicago White Sox. By the way, Michael Garcia bobblehead night, so you're going to have to pay a decent bit to get in right now, but Gametime, obviously the best place and cheapest place to get tickets, $33 to get Section 403 right now, just to give you an idea of the market. But here's what you got to do. You got to take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets by downloading the Gametime app and creating an account and using the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And now for a rather self-serving second read of the day for you. Check out the piece that Ryan Sheehan wrote on myself and this podcast at Como Magazine. It's up there on the front page. Just go to comomag.com if you want to check out a nice piece on the Locked On Mizzou podcast and your humble podcast host. But you know what? Let's talk more about Mizzou football, of course. And, of course, much has been made about Blake Baker leaving this offseason, this past offseason, I guess I should say at this point, for LSU. Missouri gave him a very, very strong offer. I think at least $2 million a year annually, maybe even a little more than that. Ultimately, Blake, though, decided to go back toward his stomping grounds and his wife's alma mater, LSU, for about $2.5 million. So quite honestly, for that price range, number one, I can understand why Missouri balked just a little bit, because while, let me be very clear about something. See, I like to sort of sometimes, to peel the curtain back a little bit, sometimes I like to obviously make some bombastic statements and then kind of walk it back a little bit analytically. So obviously when I say that Blake Baker is not God's gift to defense, well, that can be obviously taken as a pejorative. But to be clear, Blake Baker did a really good job at Missouri the last couple seasons. That's where I disagree with my buddy Jake, who thought that the Missouri defense underachieved last season. So I'm not trying to argue that Blake Baker wasn't good for Missouri. I think he was an excellent hire by Eli Drinkwitz. But basically, Jake's premise was that he thinks the Tigers underachieved because they had 5 defensive players drafted to the NFL. So they really should have been an elite unit. Well, I would just point out that really Missouri only gave up 30 points 3 times all of last season, and twice were to elite offenses in LSU and Georgia. Also, the Florida game, which was the other one, did Missouri not give up a defensive touchdown on offense there? Am I crazy? It seemed like something weird happened there. Missouri fumbled the ball and Georgia scored or something. We gave them horrible field position. I don't know. Understand I'm kind of making excuses there. But bottom line is, statistically, you look at the S&P Plus rankings, Missouri was 13th nationally on offense last year, and they were 14th on defense. That doesn't seem like a big underachievement to me. It really doesn't. Even with 5 guys drafted to the NFL, it seems like about where you should perform, maybe at the very least. If you want to say they should have been top 5, okay, I think that's a little harsh, quite honestly. So Missouri performed well defensively last season, and quite honestly, if they can even come close, if they can be a top 25 type unit, let's say they're the 25th best defense in the country this season, well, I think that's good enough to make the playoff. I really do, because the Missouri offense should be top 10 this season, maybe even top 5. You can see that happening with the quarterback, the offensive line, the receivers, and everything else that Missouri has. I think that's pretty obvious. But defensively, to me, it's much more about the players that Missouri lost. Those 5 guys that Missouri lost to the NFL, that's where I agree with the premise that, hey, those guys are really important. And it's not just the 2 corners, which I've really focused on. Of course, your best pass rusher in Darius Robinson last season, your best edge player, and of course, you lost a linebacker in Tyron Hopper. Jalen Carlisle is your free safety as well. So there's plenty of questions there. There really is. But so I just think, to me, the X's and O's aspect of it, while Blake Baker did a really good job, I just think that Corey Batoon can easily build upon what Blake Baker, the foundation he already built, which was an aggressive, mostly single high safety type of defense. You'll probably see that for Missouri again here. And again, while that was a smart move by Blake Baker, the type of defense he ran, again, I don't think it took a genius to figure out. Again, I don't mean this to sound as insulting as it's coming off right now. I just don't think it took a genius to realize, oh, maybe we should play some aggressive man-to-man defense when we have 2 NFL caliber corners on the outside. I think most of us who have played Madden or NCAA football could have figured that out, right? So, again, don't mean it to be insulting. Blake Baker did a good job. I'm just saying, I think that the defensive coordinator part of the worry about the Missouri defense, I think that's been really overblown. But what's been probably underplayed is the talent that Missouri lost on that defense. You just have to hope, to me, when you look at that, you hope that the defense can just be anywhere to the level of the last couple seasons. Because if it can, we should be in for a really, really good season. Now, when it comes to those SEC media predictions, I will say this: if Missouri finishes 6th in the SEC, that's probably not going to be good enough to get it done in terms of the college football playoff. So, but if the Tigers finish 3rd, obviously they're in. 4th, 5th, almost certainly there as well. I think the SEC will get at least 4 teams in, probably 5. 6, probably not. That's where I'm seeing it right now. Again, anything's possible. I'm just saying those are probably the most likely scenarios. So I've seen this idea bandied about the Missouri beat and Missouri fan base a little bit that, hey, if Missouri actually finished 3rd, for example, in the SEC or 4th, hey, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Maybe missing out on the SEC championship game isn't a bad thing. Heck, that helps you to get ready for the college football playoff. One less game, one fewer game against a big-time opponent where you expose yourself, your best players, to injuries and fatigue and just the mental drain of playing in that type of game, the physical drain as well, of course. Well, I understand that notion. I really do. But to me, the idea that you're better off missing the SEC title game than being in it, frankly, nuts to that, because flags fly forever. Championships fly forever. They're always going to be important. Nobody is going to remember as much. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody's going to remember. It just doesn't, it's not as good of a banner when you put, hey, we made the national semifinals in the college football playoff. Don't get me wrong, if that happens for Missouri, that's something to be proud of, and I'm sure they will post that on the press box. But man, you know it would look even better? SEC champion 2024. Now that would look unbelievable. Hey, if you want to say a national title would be even better, well, obviously. My point here is that I think people are starting to discount an SEC title a little bit, and man, do I hate that. That can't be real. That can't be possible. There's no way that people actually believe this, that the heck with the conference title when a 12-team playoff is actually more important. That just makes me a little bit queasy, I have to be honest. So I will say this, to that idea that, oh, would Missouri be better off, it does sort of come to the idea that, wait a second, is it actually harder to win the SEC now than winning the 12-team playoff? Frankly, it might be. This season, if you look at it from Missouri's perspective, you'd have to obviously be one of the top 2 teams during the regular season, and then you're probably going to have to beat Georgia in Atlanta, for example. Well, in the playoff, heck, you might get lucky and avoid Georgia, or maybe the 2 or 3 or 4 best teams. Who knows how the bracket might play out is the point. So, especially if you can get a bye, that type of thing, in theory, it could be easier to win a national title than to win the SEC. And if you think that's a crazy notion, I don't know, college baseball has kind of become that these days. It's honestly easier to win a national title. You just get into the tournament, you get hot at the right time, it might happen. We've seen SEC teams do it in recent years. So, again, just some thoughts for you there on the playoff and the SEC title. All I know is this, an SEC title would mean a little bit less than a national title to me as a fan, but not much. That would just be, I'd be about the pinnacle for me. It really would. And it seems like no Missouri Tiger has embraced the STP something to prove motto more than Luther Burden III. He is just looking for things to get mad about, and he found one even in the college football video game. Let's talk about that coming up after these quick words. Gerard Hamilton over at Power Mizzou had a story about the Tigers and their rankings and ratings in the new College Football 25 video game. Well, for his part, Brady Cook was quite happy with his 88 overall. He said, heck, I was just hoping for 85, so I'll take 88 all day long. Luther Burden, on the other hand, to his 94, being only the second best receiver rated in the game behind Colorado's Travis Hunter. Well, Burden said to that simply STP. So again, putting more stuff on the figurative bulletin board in the Missouri room. But here's a more interesting quote I thought from Burden. He said, the coolest part about being in this game, I feel just for the fans to kind of have an interaction with us, but not really, kind of indirectly. I feel like it's going to bring more attention to college football, honestly. And you know what? I totally agree with Luther there. I've said pretty much the same thing on this podcast, and especially, yeah, when it comes to actually knowing these guys and their names and knowing something about them a little bit, being able to make some kind of connection there, that'll definitely carry over to Saturdays when the games are actually being played. There's no question about that. And more in the sort of business side, in Gerard Hamilton's piece on Power Mizzou, he writes, this time, in terms of this time around for the college football video game, players who opted into the game received $600 and a free copy of the game. And for Missouri receiver Bud Sasser, who was on the previous most recent edition of the game all the way back now about a dozen years ago, Sasser said, if one thing he doesn't like about the new game is its compensation the players received in the game. He doesn't think $600 and a free copy is enough. He says, quote, I wish the athletes would be more patient. I think they deserve to be paid more than what they're getting paid for the game. Hopefully they look forward to in the future understanding that they have a lot of bargaining power, and if they would be willing to be a collective at some point in time, then they actually might get more bang for their buck. Now, I will say this. I think I mostly agree with the spirit of what Bud Sasser says. The only thing I would disagree with there is I actually think that they were smart. The players actually, it's going to turn out in the long run. I think it's going to be, sure, short term, they could have played hardball and gotten more than $600 and a free copy of the game. You're probably right about that. How much more? I'm not so sure, because there certainly is a breaking point for EA Sports on a game that, again, while very popular in its day, hasn't been in the marketplace for a dozen years. There is some risk here from their side, from a business perspective. But to his point, I do agree that in the future, they're going to really have some bargaining power here, because now that the cat is out of the bag in terms of, hey, we got real players on this game. I don't think that the marketplace, that the consumers of the game, the players of the game, are going to be willing to go back on that. I don't think they're going to react well if it's just, hey, quarterback number 12 or wide receiver number 3 for Missouri. I just don't think that's going to work anymore. So to me, though, I think long term, I think it gives the players more leverage, because this game is now out. Just the fact the game is out, it's being consumed, it's being shared all over social media. This is the most, anticipated sports game probably ever, just simply because of the amount of time the game has been gone. So basically, I think that if guys who maybe are graduating this year, like Brady Cook, maybe they're not going to be able to cash in on this. So for them, maybe this is going to be, cold comfort. But I think in the long term, I think next season, if there's another iteration of this game, whenever the next version of this game comes, you would assume next summer, right? Next July. Well, I think the players now have a lot more leverage. They can ask for a heck of a lot more than $600 in a free game the next time, because now there's going to be proof of concept. It seems like this game is going to be a wild success for EA Sports. And if I'm right, well, now the fact that the players basically allowed the game to come out show that, hey, this business model with our real names and faces, our names, images, and likenesses in the game, hey, this is a real successful business model for you. Well, guess what? Now they can ask for more piece of the pie with proof of concept. That'd be my only slight disagreement there with Bud Sasser, but he's definitely on to something there for sure. So, hey, thanks as always for listening to the Locked On Mizzou podcast, and thanks for being patient with me. I know I usually get them out Monday through Friday here in the off season, but what the heck? I needed to play some golf, and it was for a good cause too. What the heck? So until next time, again, check out my piece at comomag.com by Ryan Sheehan, a nice piece on myself and Locked On Mizzou. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked On Mizzou.